The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
The financial and economic crisis that began in 2007 is the worst the United States and the world have seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. What role did U.S. policymakers, the financial sector, world trade patterns, and other factors play in creating the meltdown? What sort of recovery can we expect to see in the coming years? Joining us to discuss the current economic situation and prospects for future recovery and reform is Desmond Lachman, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a former deputy director at the International Monetary Fund. And now the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Desmond Lachman, welcome to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you.
You've written extensively about the global economic crisis, the U.S. housing market collapse, the fate of the dollar. Help us understand what's been going on in the U.S. economy for the last few years.
Well, I think that where one has to start is that we've had the largest bubble, not only in the United States economic history, but probably in global history.
What's a bubble?
A bubble means an irrational increase in prices, that prices begin to move away from what the fundamentally value of something is. So what we had in housing is we had house prices more or less doubling between 2000 and 2006, which means that house prices totally outstripped incomes, they totally outstripped rents. So the house prices really bore no resemblance with reality, that they really got out of touch.
Now, we say that now, looking back. At the time, people just said, boy, housing is a great investment.
Well, that's very much the nature of a bubble, is when everybody thinks that something is really a great investment, more people begin to buy, banks want to lend, and this just begins feeding on itself, because then what occurs is it validates the fact that the high prices weren't stupid after all. So if year after year house prices are going up by 8, 9%, people begin to think that this will go on forever. Now, it's one thing for individuals to be thinking that, one can understand they're being mistaken, but for policymakers not to have understood this, or for the banks to have made these loans on the assumption that house prices increase forever, bordered on real stupidity, and that is really the price that we're paying, because when eventually the music stops, when the house prices begin to fall, people find that they're not as wealthy as they thought they were. The banks now begin to have huge amounts of losses, that people begin to doubt whether the banks are in a great position, begin to withdraw deposits. All of those sort of things then begin to work in reverse, and that is basically what's been going on certainly since the end of 2007. We really had the real crisis in 2008 in October when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. That's when the panic really set in. But all of this means that we've been thrown into a very deep recession. Many people have lost their jobs. Many people have had their wealth wiped out. And this takes a long time for us now to recover from this sort of episode.
Because many people think that the banks are still not whatever solvent means these days, because these loans, many of them had no collateral backing them up except whatever the house was worth. So it's not like the old-fashioned mortgage where the bank had some amount of either cash from the owner. These were no down payment mortgages in many situations. What are they called, ninja?
Right, that's basically, on Wall Street, these were referred to as ninja loans, meaning that the banks didn't mind that the people had no income, no jobs, or no assets, but nonetheless, they made a loan many times up to about 100% of the value of the house, so that as soon as the house price came down, there were these big losses. Now, you're absolutely right that the losses, banks haven't recognized all of the losses. The IMF estimates that there's something more than $1 trillion of losses that the banks still have to write down. Certain banks...
I'd say that's trillion with a T.
Exactly. That's $1,000 billion. That's really a sizable amount of money. You know, if you put it in perspective, the United States has a GNP that's around about 14 trillion. So $1 trillion is round about 8% of the United States GDP. This is a huge amount, and this explains why many of the banks still, despite all of the support that they've got from government, are not lending. And as long as you don't really get lending flowing in the economy, one really can't expect to get a very strong recovery.
And many businesses during a downturn like this need to borrow money to stay in business, and there's no money for them, so that it becomes a worsening cycle in some respects.
Oh, absolutely. That is, you hit the nail on the head, that businesses get really hit very hard in recession. Their sales go down, that they begin having losses, they then begin to need loans, and the banks are then in a phase at which they're really pulling back, that they're becoming more stringent in their lending standards than they were during the good times. So this drives it further. So we do get these vicious cycles that really spin down, and that is the reason why some sort of intervention by the Federal Reserve, massive intervention by the Federal Reserve, together with some sort of stimulus package, that made sense, because if this
so let's go back for a second. So you called this massive stupidity, but I think many people would disagree about that. So what's wrong with this picture? The people who lost money were the investors, as far as I can tell. The people who got us into this are either still making relatively big bucks compared to professors, I want to say, but also, as far as I can see, the policymakers who got us into this are still making policy. So the only people who lost were the people who had money in the bank.
Well, I think that the people who lost were people who had money in the bank together with the U.S. taxpayers, which is all of us, that...
So that means this is not so stupid.
Well, it's certainly stupid from the point of view of the average citizen who elected these officials in office, because the taxpayer is going to be given a huge bill. Our children are going to be living with this. The way in which the U.S. budget deficit has blown out, the way in which the debt is piling up, all of this is going to take us at least 15, 20 years to work our way out. It's going to have long-run effects on the way in which the U.S. economy performs. So I really hold the policymakers to blame, because they should have known, if they knew anything about economic history, if they knew about the Great Depression, if they knew about the Japanese crisis in the 1990s, it shouldn't have come as a shock to them that when a bubble bursts, it's really going to have very damaging impacts on the economy, on the financial system. And I share your puzzlement at how we've got the very same policymakers who got us into this mess, and I'm thinking of both Ben Bernanke, he was Federal Reserve Chairman since January 2006, and Tim Geithner, who was at the New York Federal Reserve right through this whole mess, that these are the people now making policy.
And again, naming names, if as I understand it, it's correct that some of the decisions about derivatives go back to the Clinton years, Larry Summers, who was Secretary of the Treasury at the end of the Clinton years, and Rubin, whose name we don't mention too much anymore, but he was, senior advisor to Obama until this all happened. So this is the same group. Well, let's name names and ask the question. So who should have been blowing a whistle and when? I suppose we start with Greenspan?
Oh, absolutely. Greenspan, I think that here's really where the bubble originates. That Greenspan, he expressed the view many times that it wasn't his job to identify bubbles, that they were really very difficult to identify. Even if he identified them, he wasn't sure what should be done. So he had a very hands-off approach. What he did as well is he eased regulation, is that he allowed a marked decline in lending standards, and he kept interest rates very low. So he really provided fuel to the bubble. This was between 2002, 2006. That this was really very much on his watch. So if there's one person who I would really attribute a lot of the blame to, it has to be Alan Greenspan. Certainly the political environment, there was very much this idea of creating an ownership society, so that encouraging people to buy houses even though they couldn't afford it, was part of the political culture. But I think that people in places like the Federal Reserve, people in academia, those are the ones that should have known better. They should have been blowing the whistle, making cautionary sounds. There were a few people, but you can count them on one, maybe two hands.
Well, that's why I hesitated to agree with the word stupidity, because it seems more systemic. There was leverage 30 times or more on some of these investments, and so one had to look at these things and say, given what was happening, boy, this is a pretty risky investment. You put it in terms of the political interest in making housing available, and this was part of this ownership society, and that was both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. But both parties had, I think, something else in common too, which is they took vast amounts of contributions from both parties. Before all this happened, if I remember correctly, there was a proposal to tax, I think it was hedge funds, the way they, I think, technically should be taxed as ordinary income, and they fought that in the Democratic caucus and stopped it from reaching the floor in the Senate. So this was a pretty potent political force in both parties to protect the way business was being done in Wall Street.
I think right now what you're seeing is you're seeing the impetus for financial market reform dying dead in its tracks. That when I think about what happened after the Great Depression, after the Great Depression, we got the Security and Exchange Commission, we got the FDIC, we got Glass-Steagall, we got real financial market reform. This time around, it's a year after the United States and global financial system practically melted down, and there's very little that one sees in terms of change in regulation. If anything, things might be getting worse, that we've got fewer banks having greater control, so we've really now got a problem of too big to fail.
Really too big to fail?
Absolutely, that we've got fewer banks making huge loans, that there's something like 4 banks that now dominate the mortgage industry, that you don't really have the competition that you had before. You've got the mixing of investment banking together with commercial banking. You've got all of the bad incentives that led you into this mess. I'd agree with you. I go back to what I said earlier, that perhaps saying that it was stupid certainly wasn't stupid from the point of view of the individuals who were making the bets. The system encouraged people to take huge amount of risk because if things worked out, they were going to become incredibly wealthy. If things didn't work out, the government would be in there to bail out the banks. That is really what we've seen. So there's really a problem here of designing the incentives correctly, and I'm afraid I don't see that this is being properly addressed at this stage. Perhaps it's a little bit early, perhaps something will come later on, but how it looks right now is that the support for real reform is really very fading fast.
But are you one of those who thinks that in some respects it's worse now than before the bubble burst, because we now also have almost, whether it's explicit or not, we have close to a government guarantee on these banks. And so where's the discipline on their lending now?
No, that's totally correct, is that what we've really done is we've injected into the system moral hazard on a massive scale, that people are really encouraged to behave in an irresponsible way because the government is going to be there to back them out, to bail them out. Now, if you've got that kind of system, then really what you need to do is you need to have very strong regulation preventing people from doing stupid things from a societal point of view. I've got very little faith in that because I think that the regulators let us down the last time around. I would far rather see us moving in a direction where we break up the banks, where we separate the investment activity from the commercial banking activity, where the system is such that you don't really rely on regulators to get things right, that you have a very much more competitive system with smaller banks. But as I say, I think that this is really wishful thinking given the way in which the political system works.
Right. In fact, I pulled out something you wrote. And this was, I think, in the Washington Post, where you're talking about the past problems in developing countries, whether it was Argentina or whatever, and Mexico, and said, at the time, I could not imagine anything remotely similar could happen in the United States. Indeed, I shared the American conceit that most emerging market nations had poorly developed institutions and would do well to emulate Washington and Wall Street. As I read what you've written and other people, I fear we look just like these emerging countries with our political institutions not remotely able to cope with the problems we see.
Yeah, I think that is really my feeling, is that we've got the same kind of political pressures that fight against reasonable economic policies. And on top of that, what we saw the whole of last year was policymakers really not knowing what was going on, which was rather a frightening prospect, that they had no clue as to the severity of the recession, how bad the asset bust was going to be, how serious the problems in the banks were going to be. We got improvisation that really reminded me of my years, when I did work on emerging market economies, policy being made late on a Sunday afternoon, only 2 hours to make the decision before the market opens. And you've got a whole lot of very poor decisions being made.
So let me put you on the spot, not for the substance now, but this is a pretty depressing conversation. So how do we get reform? Let's not decide that the reform will work. Do we need a white knight? Do we need a politician who runs for president, who says this has to be fixed? What do you see as, do Main Street bankers say this has to be fixed? What's the force that brings the change?
My experience has been that you get real reform in the midst of a crisis. And I think that is really the opportunity that was missed by the Obama administration right at the outset. That was the time in the dark days of March 2009 when everything was melting down. That was the time when the banks were weak, when the banks were already knocking at the door, asking for money. That was the time that you could have really put down conditions. There'll be other occasions, there'll be other crises where, hopefully we take advantage of those to make the reform that we don't get this repeating.
Why didn't they? Well, some of these people. Now, some of them are the same people who were there before. Why do you suppose they didn't take advantage in March of the opportunity?
Wall Street really does have a lot of clout. We've still got a lot of Goldman Sachs people floating around in policy circles. That this is really not the way in which policy should be made. That I think that one should really be standing up to the financial system, doing stuff that is in the interest of the overall economy. But I think that the links are very close. Wall Street does exert too much pressure, that there's just so many areas of reform where you'd think that things would move, yet it just seems to get totally bogged down.
This does seem like these developing countries that you were talking about, where the political institutions simply can't cope with the economic changes all around them.
Oh, absolutely. But I think that just what is a lot scarier is that we're not talking about an economy that doesn't have significance, for the whole global economy. Talking about the most important economy in the world, that looks from a political point of view, it looks dysfunctional.
Now, one of the fears that many economists have is that this could be a very long recession because consumer spending is what often helps us escape from a recession, and that implies more employment, more earnings, and this looks like a very low employment or high unemployment recovery for quite some time. Is that your sense as well, and what causes that, and how should we think about it?
Right, I would say that the recession has probably ended, that the recession would probably be dated as having ended around about June, July 2009. But the issue is, what kind of recovery are we going to get? And I think that you've really identified a key reason why one shouldn't expect a recovery of any strength, that we've got 10% unemployment right now. And what is worse is that the number of part-time workers who are working part-time involuntarily because they can't find full-time employment, that has surged. So we've got something like 16% of the US labor force that is underemployed in one way or the other. That does exert downward pressure on wages, on incomes. It means that you can't get consumption growing very much. So that is one reason why I'd expect the recovery to be very weak, and why I'd fully expect us to be living with 10% unemployment for at least throughout 2010, probably into 2011 as well. The second reason why one wouldn't expect a strong recovery is that the banks are still very unhealthy. Despite all of this money that has been poured into them, banks like Bank of America, Citibank, they're really in very bad shape. They're not lending. What is actually occurring is loans are being called back, that they're cutting credit, especially to consumers, especially to small and medium-sized businesses. So there's no way that you're going to get a very strong recovery. So I think that we're stuck with unemployment at a high level. Even though technically the economy is recovering, it's not going to feel like a recovery for a long time.
Now, let's step back for a moment before we close this segment. We're in the midst of the political back and forth with people saying the stimulus was good, the stimulus was bad. My own favorite is Warren Buffett, who said the problem with the stimulus was it was only half Viagra, meaning that half the money was not doing stimulus. When the history of this last year or two is written, how do you think mainstream economists are going to interpret the stimulus package that was passed under President Obama?
I think that they'll interpret it as another missed opportunity, that a stimulus was really needed, but what one really needed was a stimulus, using Larry Summers' words, that was timely, targeted, and temporary. We didn't get that. What we've got is we've got a stimulus which was unduly backloaded. Only something like a third of the stimulus comes into play in 2009. And many of the measures that are called stimulus cannot be called stimulus by any stretch of the imagination. A lot of pork barrel kind of spending, stuff on infrastructure that's going to take years to come through, cuts in income tax to people who you should have known from past experience were going to save most of the money. So what we've done is we've had a stimulus that's around about $780 billion. What it's done is it's put us onto a path where the United States is going to be seeing its public debt doubling over the next 10 years, the largest peacetime increase in the United States public debt. So we're going to be saddled with a very high public debt, and we're not going to be getting much recovery. So I think that the verdict on the stimulus, they're not going to give it an A.
Yeah. We only have a minute or two left. With this stupendous amount of public debt that wasn't generated at a time of war, there are, of course, I suppose, just two solutions. Higher taxes on the middle class to pay for it. There just aren't enough taxes to get from higher income, or inflation, or a mixture of the two. Before we close, your bet.
Well, my bet is that we'll probably get the inflation. I don't think that we get inflation in 2010, 2011 because the state of the economy is so bad, there's so much unemployment, it'll put downward pressure on prices. But I think what occurs is as the economy begins to return to normal and we've got this huge amount of public debt, we've got very large budget deficits, the pressures are going to be huge on the Federal Reserve not to raise the interest rates to the level that they need to do to choke off the inflation. I think that to talk about being able to have health care reform, other reforms that are going to cost a lot more in terms of public expenditure, and at the same time to say that one's not going to raise taxes for 95% of the population, I think that that is really not a recipe for sound economic management.
Well, I hate to say on that note, but on that note of realism, if not cheery realism, maybe slightly depressing realism, Desmond Lachman, thank you so much for being on Policy Watch, and I look forward to our next segment.
Well, thank you.
And for those of you in the viewing audience, if you'd like to write to us, it's policywatch.umd, that's UMD for University of Maryland, .edu, and thank you for being with us, and join us again, please.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.